start, kids. Hi, Sparky. Do I wish I knew the future? No, I don't think I'm that bothered, do you? You do, so that you could then go and jump on all of the cats? Oh, I'm not sure the prophets are that bothered about that. So this week we're looking at Ezekiel, so let's take a look.
Jerusalem had been attacked and captured, and some of the people had been taken to the powerful land of Babylon. One of them was a man named Ezekiel, who would have been a priest. 5 years later, he sat on the edge of a river. Suddenly, he began to see something strange. A storm cloud approached, and inside it were 4 wild and mysterious beasts, standing together with their wings joined, and next to them were wheels within wheels. On top of their wings was a wonderful throne, and sitting on it was a man with light pouring out of him. Ezekiel knew that it was an image of the glory of God, and he wondered what it was doing in Babylon. God showed him the temple in Jerusalem, which was filled with people worshipping other gods, and Ezekiel watched God's presence leave the temple. God put a scroll in Ezekiel's mouth and told him to share the message with the Israelites, but warned Ezekiel that no one would listen. Ezekiel got to work. God told him not only to speak, but to do strange things to get people's attention. He told him to paint the city of Jerusalem on a brick and to build mounds around it to be armies attacking it. He told him to lie on one side next to it for 390 days to represent the years of punishment for Israel, and then 40 days for Judah. All that time he had to eat dirty bread to show that the people would have to eat unclean bread. Then God told Ezekiel to cut off his hair with a sword, to burn some, scatter some, and bury some. This was a symbol of what was going to happen to the Israelites. When Ezekiel's wife died, God told him not to show that he was sad for her, as an example for the Israelites of their attitude towards God. Ezekiel spoke warnings for most of the time of what the Israelites had done and what would happen to them because of their rebellion, and against all the other countries around them too. But at the end of the book, God showed Ezekiel messages of hope for the future. He promises that a remnant of his people will return to Jerusalem. In chapter 37, God takes Ezekiel to a valley full of dry bones and skeletons, and told him to speak to them and tell them to live. Then the bones joined together and started to move, and they grew skin and everything they needed, and then they lived again. God said he would restore the Israelites like this to bring them back to life. God promised that one day he would bring his kingdom back, and a good king would rule over his people. At the end of the book, Ezekiel sees a vision of a new temple, and from it flows a river out into the city in the wilderness, and around it new life grows abundantly, showing a brand new life for God's people. God's people were not in a good place. They were in exile, they were slaves in a city they didn't belong in, they were separated from their whole lives. And then this prophet Ezekiel was telling them not only was it all their fault, but things were going to get worse too. Oh my goodness. You know, sometimes I feel a bit like everything's terrible. Maybe you do too. And often it's my fault when things have gone so wrong. And all I can see is things getting worse and worse. But the thing about Ezekiel's message is that it also contains hope. You see, in this story at the end, this amazing, crazy story, in the Valley of Bones, where everything's dry and dead and over, there's skeletons, there's skulls, there's dead bones. It looks like the end of the story, the end of life. God tells Ezekiel to speak to these bones, and then they come back to life. They become living bodies, living people, living warriors. God's command, his word, and his breath bring new life to a place that is dark and dry. From what looks still and over and finished, he brought real new life. And then at the end, it's this temple that has been torn down and destroyed, but we see it flowing with a river of amazing water that's bringing everything back into life. You know, in life, there can be moments where we do feel completely overwhelmed, like everything is over, there's nothing to do, there's no way forward. But in that moment, Spark Kids, know that God is with you. He hasn't left or abandoned you. He still has good plans for you. And even in that moment, like he brought the dry bones back to life, he can turn it round and bring something good and fresh and new. Let's close our eyes and pray together. Maybe there is something in your life that feels a bit overwhelming at the moment, and we can pray over that, or maybe everything feels good, but let's remember that God is always with us. He can always bring things back to life. It's never the end. Dear God, no matter what, you're there for me. You never leave me, even in my darkest moments. Help me to turn to you. Amen. See you next week, Spark Kids.
So you can see that the prophets were saying really important things about God's people. What do you think? Yeah, it wasn't about cats, but it was still pretty useful, don't you think? So this week we are doing a super exciting pipe cleaner craft to remind us of how crazy Ezekiel was. Are you excited? Yeah, I can't wait to see what they come up with too. See you next week.